there is a condition called chronic fatigue syndrome. From the name of this condition, it might seem like everything is clear. If a person is constantly tired, they probably have chronic fatigue syndrome, but there is a problem. The thing is, medicine recognizes that at most 1% of the population, and even then only in large cities, suffers from this chronic fatigue syndrome. So it turns out that the condition is quite rare. However, if you look around, you'll find that quite a lot of people suffer from this constant fatigue. According to data from the Public Opinion Foundation, up to 31% of Russians experience fatigue every day. So, if we take stricter medical criteria, this is generally a fairly rare condition. I think some of you watching this video might suspect that you or your loved ones or friends, relatives have some kind of chronic fatigue syndrome. And you're probably wrong, because again, this is a rare disease. And in this video, I will tell you about the medical criteria of this disease, and you will understand why it is so rare, and perhaps it is high time for you to see a doctor. And I will also share my opinion on the reasons behind such strict medical diagnostic criteria, because I just haven't found any scientific basis for these strict criteria. Who came up with these criteria and why? And most importantly, I will talk about the most common causes, according to some well-known doctors, as well as the opinions of some people who have faced this problem and successfully overcome it. I consider this problem to be very important, as we constantly receive inquiries from people describing how they feel before taking our medication. And even though I'm not a doctor, I understand that it was probably chronic fatigue, but no one even thinks about going to a doctor with this problem. And this is also, by the way, a very interesting problem. The history of the term goes back to a certain character. Her name was Florence Nightingale. She was a girl, participant in the Crimean War, a nurse. She participated in the Crimean War on the side of Great Britain. Why did I start the ancient history? So you can understand the context of the problem. One of the problems with this condition is that people, including doctors, don't believe in the existence of this issue. And patients, by the way, don't believe it either. And this problem, interestingly, is perceived by society both then and now. It's perceived not as a disease, but as a negative personality trait. And in fact, has always been perceived as a negative personality trait until the case of Florence Nightingale. She was a British girl who participated in the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 on the side of Great Britain. She is very well known, a famous figure. She is called the founder of nursing. And in this war, she distinguished herself by saving the lives of her British compatriots. And after returning from the war, she actually felt this state, this constant fatigue. That's when syndrome was described. It is interesting that it was invented because it was simply possible to make a claim to such a distinguished person as she, with such regalia and such a track record, that she was lazy and did not want to get her butt off the couch. Here, it's obvious that something is wrong, because Florence Nightingale was a person of action. Even in that state, she was practically lying down all the time, but somehow she was working on some documents for the local healthcare system in the field of nursing. In our days, one American doctor, Dr. Dawn Ellis Snipes, described these relationships well. She wrote that if you go to a doctor with this problem, the first thing they'll likely do is look at you as if you're just lazy and faking it. Interestingly, after all this time, society's attitude towards this issue hasn't really changed. She wrote that if you go to a doctor with this problem, the first thing he will most likely do is just look at you as lazy and malingering. It's interesting that after all this time, society's attitude towards this issue hasn't really changed. And proving the reality of the condition will be quite difficult. If you're not some outstanding famous person, just an ordinary person, this is despite the fact that in the United States medicine is, by the way, paid. And it would seem the perfect patient. It's incredibly profitable to treat such an abstract condition. You can make a lot of money. It's a very interesting story about the introduction of the disease itself, not just the term. It's truly an intriguing story. In scientific circles, it's referred to as the mystery of Lake Tahoe. It's a small lake in Nevada in the USA. It all started In 1984, with an unexpected outbreak of a disease that was later classified as chronic fatigue syndrome, local doctors Paul Cheney and Daniel Peterson noticed that specific complaints about fatigue, dizziness, and muscle weakness were spreading among the population. And pain. There are problems with memory, concentration, and so on. When the number of complaints reached a critical level, the doctors reported the data to the Centers for Disease Control in the US. This caught the attention of specialists who began to investigate the situation. A total of 200 cases were recorded. This is by 1989. These doctors suggested that the disease might be linked to the Epstein-Barr virus. But there were serious issues with this conclusion, as the virus was not found in 5% of the people who had chronic fatigue syndrome. And in 25% of the patients, the antibodies were not elevated. And given that the work itself states that almost the entire adult population of the United States of America is a carrier of the Epstein-Barr virus, these were completely normal figures. Thus, a great deal of research work was carried out. A disease was clearly formulated, which had specific symptoms, but at the same time, the causes of this disease were never actually found. And by the way, it still hasn't been found. EBV is linked to fatigue syndrome, but not confirmed as the cause. In 25% of patients, antibodies weren't elevated, and in 5%, it wasn't found. And at that time, the perception of chronic fatigue syndrome started to emerge as a consequence of the activation of the Epstein-Barr virus. Although I said that 25% of those who fell ill, in general, did not have elevated antibodies, which means that they simply had this virus a long time ago, and 5% did not have them at all. Antibodies, meaning they didn't even have the Epstein-Barr virus at all. And since then, the perception of this disease as a consequence of a viral infection has remained, and it's still present today. I saw on Dr. Komarovsky's show that he mentioned it's related to the Epstein-Barr virus. Dr. Berg in some of his videos says that we need to treat the Epstein-Barr virus. In Germany, there's the famous Charité hospital where Navalny was treated. There was also a film released on Deutsche Welle about the research, and they were begging for money for research on the connection with the Epstein-Barr virus. Although it was already known 100 years ago that this is not the case. But they are kind of at the tail end of modern science. Actually, the version proposed by Eric Johnson sounds more realistic. He suggested that the outbreak is linked to the impact of toxic cyanobacteria and possibly a few other toxins, which in turn affected the virus, making it more pathogenic. By the way, Eric Johnson was the first identified patient, the first documented case of chronic fatigue syndrome, but without any traces of the Epstein-Barr virus. There's even a YouTube video, a very interesting interview. He got chronic fatigue syndrome during the outbreak in 1984 at Lake Tahama and managed to recover by 1990. He suffered from this illness for 6 years. He believed that there are many similarities between the outbreak at the lake and what's called sick building syndrome. What is sick building syndrome? It's a condition where the occupants of a building experience discomfort or illness related to being in a specific space. These symptoms, like headaches, dizziness, eye irritation, nasal irritation, and so on, are usually temporary and go away when you leave the building. The causes are well known and studied. It's poor ventilation, insufficient fresh air intake, and all of this can lead to the accumulation of pollutants inside, both chemical and biological. They can include emissions from building materials, furniture, carpets, printers, and copiers. Most importantly, biological pollutants like mold, pollen, and viruses can also contribute to the symptoms of sick building syndrome. One of the valuable ideas, in my opinion, is that we need to try to avoid mold. So this idea of Johnson's, we need to avoid mold, he actively promoted the idea that improving indoor air quality can significantly reduce symptoms. He demonstrated this through his own experience and managed to draw the medical community's attention to the potential environmental causes of chronic fatigue syndrome, which later stimulated more extensive research in this area. And that's exactly why you can look at the studies where Johnson recommended avoiding prolonged stays in places with high humidity and mold. He suggested using natural and eco-friendly cleaning products, which is a simple thing that helps minimize exposure to chemicals. His colleague, Dr. Lisa Peterson, co-authored a whole book about Johnson called Back from the Edge. How one discovery allowed a person suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome to get back on their feet and conquer the summit of Mount Whitney in just 6 months. I already mentioned that there were serious scientific studies on this topic. These studies found that chronic fatigue syndrome is often associated with sick building syndrome. Both conditions can arise from inadequate ventilation and the presence of specific toxins or microorganisms in the space. The simplest increase in fresh air intake sometimes reduces symptoms, but it doesn't always completely solve the problem. And in this scientific article, it is suggested that chronic fatigue syndrome may arise after exposure to both infectious agents and chemical toxins, highlighting the complexity in determining the specific causes of this condition. Going back to the medical criteria and the issue of medical criteria for this condition, chronic fatigue has incredibly strict criteria. A person must experience chronic fatigue for at least 6 months and should be in a state of fatigue for at least 50% of the time, not counting sleep. So, lying around without any strength for half a day. In the US, there are additional criteria. This alone doesn't provide a clear clinical picture. There must be several accompanying symptoms. And among these symptoms, there should be at least 4, which I'll list. These include memory problems, concentration issues, sore throat, pain in the lymph nodes, muscle aches, joint pain, and headaches. Sleep disturbances, some kind of weakness lasting more than 24 hours. These are the American criteria. There are also international criteria that were established in 2011. A group of experts. They contain fewer points, but also have requirements for a duration of 6 months and the presence of pain. So, with all these strict requirements, according to American doctors, up to 1% of the population in cities lives with this. And Dr. Lisa Snipes, whom I mentioned earlier, briefly mentions in her extensive video that if you slightly loosen these criteria, in reality, up to 7% of the population in cities would be suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. They just don't meet those strict criteria. And Dr. Lisa Snipes, whom I mentioned earlier, briefly mentions in her extensive video that if you slightly loosen these criteria, in reality, up to 7% of the population in cities would be suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. They just don't meet those strict criteria. And here we realize that the condition is no longer rare, but quite common. They just don't meet those strict criteria. And here we realize that the condition is no longer rare, but quite common. In Snipes' video, which is a very long, almost 2-hour video, I found one very interesting thought that one of the main consequences of CFS is a disorder of oxygen supply. It plays a significant role in worsening the symptoms. This issue can affect overall health, and the causes may be related to poor circulation and a reduced ability of tissues to absorb oxygen. And our medication is just perfect for addressing at least this problem. It has already been proven that Synthesit helps improve blood circulation and enhances blood oxygenation. So, regarding the impact on energy metabolism, a lack of oxygen hinders the adequate production of ATP, which is the main source of energy. This will lead to a decrease in overall energy and general weakness, muscle fatigue. And poor oxygen supply will cause increased tiredness and even pain. With slight physical exertion, which makes it difficult to perform everyday tasks, cognitive functions, insufficient oxygen, and inadequate oxygen supply to the brain worsen memory and cause brain fog. This is all typical for patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. From the perspective of the immune system, its functioning also depends on adequate oxygen supply, and a lack of it can lead to increased susceptibility to infections. It was also very interesting that, according to Dr. Snipes, the main cause of chronic fatigue syndrome is a cardiovascular issue, specifically a decrease in cardiac output or problems with blood circulation. They can restrict the intake of oxygen and create respiratory disorders. In some cases, for example, sleep apnea and other respiratory disorders can contribute to a decrease in oxygen saturation. Again, our medication can help with this issue, because it improves the condition of the cardiovascular system. It's known that Synthesit helps reduce the pulse zone in athletes, and we also have a lot of feedback from people saying they feel like their heart is working better, that it's easier for them. Well, that's natural because Synthesit promotes the disaggregation of red blood cells, making the blood thinner, which makes it easier for the heart to pump it, so it's easier on the heart. So, this is one of the factors that helps address issues with the cardiovascular system. I also decided to include in this video a few reviews from people, regular patients and bloggers, who simply talk about how they lived with this problem, how they overcame it. One of those characters is Silk de Wolf. She has 39,000 followers and she suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome for 10 years. She believes that the illness started after a tough year when she caught a cold 3 times. One interesting thing is that moving didn't help her. And the place where she lived, in Belgium, she tried moving to London for a year, but her chronic fatigue syndrome only got worse. She tried acupuncture, yoga, and other things. It didn't help her. Overall, she believes that her physical condition was completely fine. So it was purely a psychological problem. However, from the perspective of her physical condition, she did one significant thing. She added fish to her diet. So, unlike all those charlatans, there's a real doctor, a real physician. His name is Dr. Hyman. I found his videos to be the most interesting. He believes that chronic fatigue syndrome is a condition that has real causes, not psychosomatic ones. That's why I really liked his personal opinion, his personal experience. The thing is, Dr. Hyman had mercury poisoning over 20 years ago when he was studying, and some additional problems with the intestines. And when he found this problem, when he was able to solve his issue, and when a person has problems with some kind of poisoning, for example, heavy metals, then of course no psychological help can make them healthy. It might seem to him that he's feeling better, but still, chronic fatigue is an objective reality, and I completely agree with that. And it's not about Dr. Berg, not about Dr. Snipes, but specifically about Dr. Hyman, a person who has experienced this illness. It may seem to him that he feels better there, but chronic fatigue is still an objective reality, and I absolutely agree with that. And it's not about Dr. Berg, not about Dr. Snipes, but specifically about Dr. Hyman, a person who has experienced this illness. I think his approach is the most interesting, the most important, and the most objective. So Dr. Hyman, he's among, by the way, he's a very well-known American internet doctor. He has his own clinic and he has videos that gather millions of views. And that video about chronic fatigue gathered millions of views. In these videos, he talks about the fact that there can be dozens of causes of chronic fatigue. These are issues with the intestines, Lyme disease, tick infections, mold, heavy metals, inflammation, free radicals, and so on. But all these causes have something in common. All these things damage the mitochondria, which requires a comprehensive approach for recovery. The comprehensive approach to treatment, according to Dr. Haim, explains that to support the mitochondria, a diet, lifestyle changes, stress reduction, and light physical exercise are necessary. And he believes it's important to eliminate causes like Lyme, mold, heavy metals, meaning to identify and remove them. What I found most interesting is that in his view, while there can be many causes, the mechanism is roughly the same. And he believes that it is important to eliminate the causes, such as Lyme scale, mold, heavy metals, that is, to find them and eliminate them. What I found most interesting is that in his understanding, the main role is that there can be many causes, but the mechanism is roughly the same. He believes that this condition is related to damage to mitochondrial function. The causes can be different, any of the things I described earlier, but the result will always be chronic fatigue. This is where Synthesit shows the highest effectiveness. From Zovtaradak's research, we know that Synthesit has a huge impact on biogenesis in the mitochondria. An increase in ATP production has been found, which boosts metabolism and the adaptive processes within the cells. Most likely, it gives a very small but crucial boost at the cellular level, helping the body to come out of a state of energy deficiency. And this, after some time, allows one to recover from chronic fatigue syndrome. Synthesit is the perfect medication for support in cases of chronic fatigue syndrome. Even if this chronic fatigue syndrome doesn't meet the commonly accepted criteria